Well, good evening and a very warm welcome from Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you may be in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Max Olesker, and I'll introduce Max to you in just a moment. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. And can I also draw your attention to the chat facility you have? This allows you to send a message to everyone else on this webinar, should you wish to do so, but it's best not to use the chat for asking questions. Finally, we are recording this event and you'll find it in the next couple of days on our website at milim.org.uk. There you will find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Max Olesker is a multi-award-winning comedian, a contributing editor at Esquire, and was once Britain's youngest professional wrestler. He is one half of the globally acclaimed comedy double act Max and Ivan, who have created sitcoms for TV and radio and have performed their intricate multi-character shows internationally. Max is author of this book, Making the Cut, an unorthodox love story, which we will be discussing this evening. So Max, a very warm welcome to Milim. Really nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And may I just say how in awe I am of the technical prowess and overall slickness of this entire operation. It's absolutely set the bar. I'm blown away.
Well, you're very kind. I mean, if you're still saying that in an hour, we'll know we've got something right. So tell us in a nutshell, what's this book about?
It is about how I met a woman at a bar in the depths of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. We fell in love, and then I discovered some months later that it would be impossible for us to be together unless I were to embark on the Orthodox Jewish conversion process, which was a challenging piece of information for a number of reasons. Not only is it famously difficult, deemed by many the most difficult religious conversion in the world, but also I was already Jewish, or so I thought. And what followed was a period of soul searching and identity crisis, as I discovered the concept of being halakhically Jewish in the Orthodox sense, and discovered that my mother's Reformed conversion was not deemed valid, and all of the practical reverberations of that. So it's the story of learning this, of meeting someone, of falling in love, and how after a period of reflection and indeed of trying to find a path forward in life that didn't involve this path, it became clear that that was the only way forward. And I embarked on this process. And indeed, Eliana, my partner, embarked on it with me, because as part of the process, couples, go through it together. And it's the story of us attempting to go through this process.
Okay, so we'll dig into that in a moment or two, but this is your first book, and
yes,
although you're a writer, you've written comedy, you've written for stage and television. So what was it a struggle to find your voice for this, or did it come naturally? Was the transition from comedy scripts to a memoir an easy one?
The voice wasn't necessarily the hardest bit. It was one of those things that came. I produced various pieces of work, and you always kind of try and find the medium that suits the form. And having staggered to the end of this process, which towards the end kind of went slightly off the rails in a number of ways, and I kind of got to the end of it and knew that I would need to reflect on it in some way and create some kind of work. And I wasn't really sure what that might be. And in the comedy work that I've been creating with Ivan, our shows are becoming increasingly kind of self-referential and self-reflective, increasingly personal, I suppose. And indeed, some of the features writing that I had been producing was starting to draw on various elements of my life. But I'm not naturally, as a comedian, I'm not naturally a kind of confessional, like, okay, guys, here, let me tell you absolutely everything that's happened over my last year. That was never my sort of métier. But this was a personal story, and also it felt so sort of fiendishly complex. I'd sit with mates in the pub, non-Jewish mates, and explain it to them, and it would inevitably completely dominate whatever lunch or catch up that we were trying to have because I try not to, but they go, come on then, mate, like, how are things? And then I'd explain, and it would take so long to explain the knotted, convoluted kind of twists and turns of the whole narrative that I felt that in order to kind of expunge this extraordinary kind of series of chapters of my life, a book was the only way to kind of do it kind of coherently and try and do justice to some of the nuances of it. So it was absolutely a challenge because I'd never created anything of this scale before. But there was the upside of that it did happen to me, and I couldn't have been closer to the material. So it was a question of sitting down and recounting it in the manner that felt like it made the most sense. And after a few chapters, it began to kind of take shape.
So you said you thought you were Jewish. What sort of childhood did you have? Was there much Jewish about your upbringing?
Well, I was the most Jewish person in my inner city Portsmouth State Secondary School. So I had nothing really to compare it to. Portsmouth, my hometown, not recently celebrated for its Yiddishkeit. Although 500 years ago, it was a hub. And as the lovely people in the shul will remind us when we pop by. But yes, in fact, it's partly because of the fact that the very lovely Orthodox shul, which turns out to be a 2-minute walk from my family home, and good grief, many things in life would have been simpler. But let alone the fact that it would have been nigh and impossible for my mum to convert Orthodox whilst living in Portsmouth. Um, she also felt that because it was quite a small community and quite a senior community, having 3 young boys growing up, there'd be very little for us to connect to if that was the one our one kind of window into Judaism. So she took the decision, and my parents were quite freewheeling and bohemian. So it's also perhaps that progressive Judaism aligned with their values, but also I think it was the fact that we would have friends in this community. If she went progressive, if she went reform, there were kids my age who I could have, I'd go to their bar mitzvah and they'd go to mine, and you'd go to cheder and you'd enjoy it and you'd resent it a bit, and that's all part of it. And it would be a slightly more living, breathing insight into what Jewish life could mean for me if that were part of my personality, that part of my identity that I wish to kind of embrace. So yeah, for that kind of hodgepodge of reasons, that is why my mum converted via the Reform movement. My father was Jewish, and yeah, they're both bohemian, both creative and artistic. I'm not sure either would describe themselves as religious particularly, but my father was his Jewish identity was deeply important to him, and we were raised in an extremely culturally Jewish home full of Yiddish folk songs and stories. The festivals were always part of my life for as long as I can remember. And yeah, when bar mitzvah time came around for some of my older friends, and I went to their bar mitzvahs and I got to experience that part of life. It wasn't something it wasn't inflicted on me. I wasn't told that I had absolutely no choice. I was told that I could. It was something that I had the opportunity to engage in. And if I did, it wasn't just about having a great big party and dressing up and making a speech. It was a responsibility, and there's a great deal of work and preparation. But that if that was something that I wanted to to participate in, I could, and I chose to do so. And I'm the oldest of 3, and perhaps as a result, I don't know whether they were, whether that informed their choice as well. But my brothers and I all had bar mitzvahs and all invited our, primarily non-Jewish schoolmates along to this kind of cultural milestone. But also my Jewish relatives from around the world came and joined, and that was sort of the bedrock and the basis for my understanding of my identity. And it wasn't something I gave huge amounts of thought to, but it was never not there. And I went off to university and and to wrestle professionally, all the normal things a teenage boy does. But I would come back to the South Hampshire community that my mum was a part of, my parents' family were a part of, and join them for for holidays and high holy days and things. And it was just it was sort of it was there, and it was not something that I questioned until until some months after having met and fallen in love with Eliana and began to sense a hum of complication on the horizon.
So was she your first Jewish girlfriend?
Yes, I believe so.
Mm.
Yes, she was indeed. Yeah, it hadn't been something I'd ever given any thought to in terms of, as in, I'd never for a second viewed someone non-Jewish as off limits or anything. And I mean, my parents, again, very liberal. The question was never, if I've got a partner, are they Jewish? It was, well, do they think you're wonderful and are they nice? That was the first and foremost. I think I'd probably always imagined having some sense of a Jewish identity and a Jewish wedding and that my children would have that again as part something that they could embrace and engage with or not depending on how that felt to them. But yes, as I believe I mean yeah, certainly my first ever serious relationship was Jewish without a shadow of a doubt.
So when did the penny drop that all was not good, and how did that make you feel when you'd grown up to believe you were, you were as Jewish as you needed to be?
Yes. Well, I suppose I was as Jewish as I needed to be up until that moment.
Mm.
And then it became apparent that my hesher was insufficient. And for someone who is mehedrin mi mehedrin, you got to achieve a higher status of kashrus. Um, I It all began with a glorious misunderstanding in that when Eliana and I were chatting in a bar, she'd seen the comedy show that I performed with a man. And although it isn't remotely central to the narrative of the show, I can't remember which show it was, there'd been some offhand reference to me being Jewish. And she said, I like the Jewish jokes. And I said, well, that's okay. I'm allowed to make them. And she said, can I buy you a drink? And that's how things began. And from a position I'd thought of mutual understanding. And I didn't realize that she had cottoned on, even over the course of that night, that there would be potentially devastating ramifications down the line. And she didn't give too much thought to it at that point because, who's to say where a drink in a bar in Edinburgh will lead? Historically, that can be a recipe for some of the most short-term relationships, not one that may end up changing the trajectory of your life. And also, I think there was possibly the sense of being drawn to someone and let's not front load all of the complications now. Let's see where this goes and where this could go.
Mm.
So yes, it took a while. It was definitely a period of months. I didn't realize that she was Orthodox, for instance,
Mm.
because due to my due to the way I'd grown up in Portsmouth with an uncle who was part of our family. He was Orthodox, but that my understanding of Orthodox was black hat Haredi.
Mm.
So that I envisaged this spectrum with the kind of freewheeling progressive um, Jews hanging out on one end and the Haredim on the other. And I had never encountered, because my university was just outside London. It was a particularly non-Jewish university, I would say. Um, so again, I was one of the most Jewish people at that university, and the other Jewish bloke on my course and I are still firm friends. But what I'd never encountered up until that point, or knowingly encountered, was modern Orthodoxy. And so when a dazzling woman in a bar plies you with disgusting Jaeger bombs at some unthinkable hour in the morning, I wasn't necessarily drawing a direct line between that and and sort of identity shattering theological questions. It was only as months went by and I discovered that she was Orthodox and that there's a whole community in the United Kingdom of people with sort of both feet in both worlds, entirely modern, entirely of the modern world, but also preserving and maintaining these centuries old traditions. Millennia old, that I began to get a sense, a kind of a humming sense of worry about what the possible kind of implications could be. And there was another conversation that we had again months in, where Eliana alluded to the fact that she would never make someone do the Jewish conversion because it's the hardest in the world. And I remember sitting and laughing and going like, oh goodness. And at that point, I was sort of sympathizing. In my mind, I was on the same side of the table, being like, well, never mind. Oh, goodness me. At least we don't have to worry about that. And it was only, and yeah, as soon as I became aware of the issue, I started kind of researching what the implications might be, and was then so aghast at said implications that it then took me another few months to raise the question because there was an answer that was seeming increasingly likely and was seeming increasingly devastating, and I was increasingly unwilling or unable to hear. But it was also unavoidable. So there was this sense of, a train hurtling towards us that we were both slightly in denial about. And then I did eventually raise raise the subject, and we did eventually have a fraught and weighty, days long conversation about what this meant and how Eliana felt about my identity and how she felt about Judaism and the disconnect and what all of this might mean. And it resolved absolutely nothing, but it did bring the subject out into the open and allow us to at least acknowledge it and know that it was there. And then, in an oddly, bizarrely convenient way, the global pandemic shut down the world and allowed us to put a pause on this conversation and live delusionally in a bubble in multiple senses, for I don't know, a year, during which time I locked down with Eliana and her family, and all of the previous both spoken and unspoken elements of our life were slightly on hold. There's a if the world's ending, we can let's all just take a breath and be together and kind of, not overcomplicate things. And so I sort of unofficially knew her family and her parents. They were nothing but lovely to me, and I would see them and we would go for meals and things. But there was I'd never been to Shabbat dinner. I'd never been to Friday night dinner, and it was up until this giant summit conversation. It was so we were spending so much time together. We were so delighted to be with one another. But on Fridays, it just never happened, and neither of us spoke about it. And this, to me, was the elephant in the room. And we didn't address this until we finally had this big conversation. But during lockdown, not only did I bubble with them, not only was I fully integrated into the family that I joined for Friday night dinner, and the wild sort of makeshift like Shabbat morning services that Eliana's dad had a go at leading in at one point in the depths of lockdown. Good grief! What I got to experience was something I never would have been able to experience in all likelihood any other way, which was this sort of demo stage of life together and an example, an actual lived experience of what modern Orthodox life can be like, or certainly their interpretation of it. And it was warm and it was loving, and it featured things that I recognized from my own childhood, and it featured a host of things that I didn't. But it meant that it wasn't just this fraught, divisive conversation that we'd had about differing modes of belief and existence, and this kind of piece of what felt to me like theological bureaucracy that sort of discounted me as a human being, and then this enormous list of obligations and things that one must do in order to try and kind of make two lives come in, sync up in some way. So it meant that at the end of lockdown, whilst the flattening of the curve and the lowering of the rates of COVID and things did mean that our previously paused discussion had to continue. It meant at least I had some level of insight in a human and holistic way that I would never have had before. And it was totally impossible to commit to the Orthodox conversion process just immediately, because it was still such a daunting,
Mm.
difficult, confrontational thing, and I had to work out how I felt about it, and there were so many elements. But it did mean that when I went off back to my place in East London, was sort of soul searching about what it would mean. It meant that I had some level of insight into what a life together might be like in a way that I just don't think would have been possible in any other version of history.
Interesting, but obviously um, very different obligations on you in order to get to that point. Um, so what do you do? How do you start? How do you become Orthodox Jewish?
How do you become Orthodox Jewish? Well,
Well,
if you,
other than the obvious. Uh,
well, the most obvious thing happens right at the end. But to become Orthodox Jewish, if you are not deemed so in the first instance, requires contacting the Beth Din, which is generally done via the auspices of a supporting, sponsoring rabbi, whom it would behoove you to meet and develop a relationship with, a connection with, a mentorship, because they will be the person who will send the letter and an accompanying letter attesting to your credibility. As a prospective convert, you will have likely begun going to shul with some regularity and starting to attempt to familiarize yourselves with with the Shacharit morning blessings. And then it's a question of waiting. There's a fair amount of that. I think it's accurate to say. And then things progress in a gradual period of correspondence and dialogue with the Beth Din, who will write back, not necessarily swiftly, but eventually. Um, and it becomes a case of sort of presenting your case to them, answering any additional questions that they may have, um, continuing with, with sort of perhaps a greater unofficial program of Jewish learning, but kind of immersing yourself in, you know, in Jewish studies, and until eventually a meeting is convened. If you're in a relationship, then you would attend that with your partner as well, even if they are halakhically Jewish. Um, and especially if they're not, there are cases where two people convert simultaneously. And then you get to meet the Beth Din and talk to them about what this, what brought you here, how you found yourself here. And then some weeks after that, there will be further correspondence attesting to whether or not you are accepted onto the program. Um, at which point a formal course of study begins, and with it all of the various kind of obligations beholden to an Orthodox Jew. So, you know, keeping Shabbat, keeping keeping kosher, and shul attendance sort of ramps up steadily. I think that they it is certainly a process of kind of total immersion by the end, but equally, I think they're cautious of people turning up with the shining eyes of a zealot and going, I'm going to shul 12 times a day because I want it more than anyone else. And so if you were to turn up with with payos and a floor length beard after 3 months, I think that would probably be cause for concern. So it is certainly a question of these kind of, these things, these observances being taken on in what's felt to be a kind of scalable and sustainable sort of manner. But once you're accepted onto the program and up and running, then the next grand part of the journey involves moving in to the house of an Orthodox family. So in my case, that involved moving from from Primrose Hill, where I've been living, to Hendon and living with an extraordinary family in Hendon who took me in. They had 7 children, and I became their idiot eighth child, sleeping in the spare room in their attic. And that is a period of, you know, of immersing yourself in a world which may be quite different to the one that you had previously experienced. And, for me, growing up in Portsmouth and attending the South Hampshire Reform community, even my United Synagogue adventures in Primrose Hill, what seemed unthinkably esoteric at first. So to then jump cut to Hendon, Golders Green, and Brent Cross, it was a quite a change. And
So
yeah.
what was it like? I mean, you referred to it, I think, as the area, and
Mm.
then within the area there are other areas of sort of more piety. How did you find it? Did you find it warm and welcoming, or was it a bit oppressive?
I mean, firstly, it absolutely was very, very warm and welcoming. And yes, the area, or the Cholent Pot,
Mm,
as it's sometimes referred to, I have to sort of, I have to preface any description of my time there by emphasizing that the welcome that I received, because it was extraordinary. And it was, yeah, it was, I met them for a coffee, and by the end of that, I hadn't finished my coffee by the time I was welcomed into this family's home, which was jaw dropping, purely as a mitzvah. It was done simply because they felt that they had had lots of good fortune in their life, and they felt that it was incumbent upon them to share that. And Eliana, my partner, who was also asked to move into the area by the Beth Din, her welcome was even more freewheeling, and that someone told someone that Eliana was looking for somewhere to stay, and she received a voice note from a woman she'd never met going, "Oh, wonderful. Well, look, you can move in next week, and if we're not here, then the key will be under the mat or something." It was absolutely bizarre. We couldn't understand it. Um, that said, I was in a very different environment, and I was living a lifestyle which was totally transformed from months or years previously. And it was quite disconnected in lots of ways from a lifestyle that was familiar to me previously. Um, and then added to that is the complication that my father had been diagnosed with dementia, and this happened after I'd begun the process. But in amongst all of the chaos and drama and broigas of the discussions that Eliana and I were having about identity and conversion and so on, in amongst this was the knowledge that we were doing this in order to get married, to start a life together under the chuppah. And um, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and Eliana's fabulous and beloved grandmother was now in her 90s, albeit formidably vibrant and strong. But we felt the additional pressure of this sort of ticking clock, and I felt extremely aware of the time that I wasn't able to be with my father, and I knew that there is an element of needing, or feeling at least, that one needs to be seen, at these, at this shul, or at this kiddush, or at this minyan, because that's exactly how it is, how the entire thing is sort of is run. It is on this basis of, it is, for better and worse, it is propagating this tight knit community and placing you within a tight knit community, and it is astonishing to see how it functions and to participate as part of it. And there's a hugely comforting feeling to that in lots of ways. But there were certainly times when that period of time felt oppressive, not necessarily because of living in that community, but because of being bound up in a process which I had no control over, which is something you sign up for at the start. And as my uncle, in fact, my Haredi uncle, who I mentioned, for various reasons, was not born halakhically Jewish. So he converted, and so I had some very insightful conversations with him. He being the one providing all the insight, I should clarify. But the key sentence that I sort of returned to throughout the process was his statement that you are. He said you're used to being a Western consumer with Western consumer rights. That's more or less how you go about the world. Within this process, that is not the case. You are a supplicant, and that is how those are the terms to which you are subscribing when you begin this process. And I was aware of that intellectually from the start, but it didn't mean that I dealt with it particularly well at all times. And certainly those winters in Hendon, feeling quite disconnected from the life that I knew, and knowing that there were things out of my control or places that I would wish to be with my family that I felt that I couldn't. Those were extraordinarily challenging at times.
Did you find the Dayanim at the Beth Din reasonable? Were they challenging you? Were they difficult? I mean, you've said you're not in a situation where you're a Western consumer buying a product, but were they rational in how they dealt with you, or were they continually shifting and moving the goalposts?
I would say they were extremely rational in that
Mm.
I can see where and understand where every single one of their decisions came
Mm.
from. Um, that said, we came from very different worlds. We were unlikely to see eye to eye on, you know, a, a number of things. Um, and I was an unusual case, I would imagine. Needless to say, I've not been permitted to flick through a brochure of previous successful or unsuccessful converts or gay roots applicants, but a narrative sketch comedian slash magazine features writer slash occasional professional wrestler it's a slightly odd pitch for most things, let alone um, the Orthodox
Yes, what
Jewish.
kind of job is this for a Jewish boy to
Well,
to
this
have? Yeah.
there was something of a showdown in which they finally Googled my comedy career and didn't like what they saw. Everyone's a critic. But yes, the slightly mind-bending question of is comedy any sort of job for a Jew, which was one of the funniest things I'd ever heard, but also something I was completely forbidden from laughing at in that room, or rather, laughing at it would have been utterly
Mm.
against my best interests. So there were there were ideological differences at various points, and they were extremely difficult those differences were difficult to navigate at various points. And I've
Were
tried.
you able to keep working? Were you able to keep doing what you did?
I was. I mean,
Mm.
that, needless to say, comedy often happens at the weekends. So
Mm.
a huge part of my reservations at the very start of the whole process were, is this something I can, is this something I can commit to? This is, the thought of turning down those moments feels excruciating because it's such I've never been a salaryman. I've never had a corporate 9 to 5. I've existed in a world where you kind of swing from vine to vine, and the more proactive you are and the more in the world you are, the more the more possible things seem to be. So knowing that I was voluntarily shutting myself off felt slightly terrifying. But it's something that I committed to, and during the process, yes, it was, it at the start it was slightly crushing to turn my phone back on and not have received the email or voicemail from Steven Spielberg that I was certain was going to come in just at that, on that Friday evening. And yes, there were gigs and shows and things that it was very difficult to kind of recuse yourself from. But once it was sort of, once it was set, it was there, and it was possible to do it. And I even managed, there were projects that I had concerns about that I was able to, I was filming a sitcom event, and I'd written a sitcom that we were filming, and I just, explained like this, I was able to have Shabbat hours built into my sitcom. And I said, this is when this is when I'm available. To which I'd been slightly panicking again because we'd fought so hard to get this job into, to will this thing into existence, and then COVID almost shut it down. So it all felt like it was hanging on by a thread. And for me to kind of come wading in with a series of esoteric availability times that are based on the sun's, 15-minute increments every week. However, luckily, an experienced and very calm-headed producer on the show said, look, every single actor gives us their availability. That's how we shoot TV shows. That's just your availability. Like, that onwards, on we go. So yes, there were questions about my comedy career. But I was able to, we had some hairy moments as I kind of write about in the book. There were, a number of somewhat emergency meetings were convened, but with the support of various other kind of supportive rabbis and Eliana and her family, and we were supporting each other. That yes, we were able to stagger through those.
But you also had this no touching rule. How did that affect your relationship?
Very, 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 very negatively.
Mm.
I see not a single positive to this rule, and I found it extraordinarily difficult. And it led to all manner of disagreements and rows, not purely, but often because of what it felt like it represented, because Eliana would feel me snapping at at a series of things that she held so dear, i.e. the entire edifice of Judaism, the notion of Judaism as a whole. So then we'd be rowing about all sorts of things. But to be in a situation where for an unspecified period of time, ongoing, with kind of 6-month increments approximately of when you might know more or might not, but it is very approximately, and that those meetings are, they happen when they happen, and the correspondence arrives when it arrives. And again, you're not calling the shots. The entire notion of having your fate sort of frozen in aspic or held in suspension, whatever metaphor you want to reach for, that alone is extraordinarily difficult, because needless to say, it's extremely disempowering. And by the time that, you are living, sleeping in a single bed in a teenage boy's previous bedroom and concussing yourselves on the eaves of the ceiling as you kind of roll the wrong way up and you kind of stagger out into the world, there's something it's fairly excruciating about your partner living 2 meters across the road from you, but you not being allowed to so much as sort of hold her hand. So yes, that would absolutely added to the vertiginous kind of difficulty of the challenge. And again, it is something that we were aware of intellectually at the start, but it was, yes, it was fairly wretched.
You wrote about you and Eliana attending the March of the Living in Poland, and you point out that the Nazis only required one grandparent to condemn someone for being Jewish. And at that point in the book, you refer to the conversion process to be nothing more than a trite game, an extended power play from which God is entirely absent, which is I understand exactly why you would say such a thing, but to still continue through the process, if that's what you're thinking, must be really tough.
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt at the time. I remember this feeling kind of seething with so many different conflicting feelings at the time. Um, it felt grueling but important to go on the March of the Living that year, whilst we were in the midst of all of this, this Jewish moment in our lives, and also whilst there were survivors there whose testimony that we could hear, and to visit these sites with them and understand as best we could what happened. Um, and needless to say, I was confronted with all all manner of, the worst atrocities that humanity has kind of inflicted upon itself. But that, and it felt also colossally selfish to at any level be pouting about my own halachic status with my own paltry, comparatively utterly non-existent problems. And I suppressed them for the entirety. I was aware of them, but I didn't even so much as reflect inwardly on them throughout that time. We were there to bear witness and to grieve and to listen to these people. It was extraordinary. But I was just aware of this a series of, it shone a light on a series of things about my own identity, and it threw into sharp relief my feelings later when the dust had settled and I allowed myself to think about the fact that there were 35 Oleskers in the Book of Names in Auschwitz, and my connection to them or not, and the fact that it seems deeply invidious that it's possible to be killed for living what you deem to be a Jewish life for the crime of being Jewish, and that the only people who might seek to disaffirm that identity happen to be Jewish.
Mm.
But throughout all of the deepest kind of swamps of misgiving, the the one thing that felt straightforward and simple to me was the notion of starting a life with Eliana, and it felt like, in amongst all the other complexities, if I could focus on that, we could get there, then there's the prospect of a far simpler and less fraught world. And those, I felt it was important to recall the high peaks of frustration or anger even that I experienced when I did, and for the reasons that I did. But those aren't things that I hold on to now that, and look, spoiler alert, we got married. But do still read the book, obviously, guys. But yes, they're not things that I cling to.
So you go through this process of structured tuition. You're living with a family. How do you know when the sort of end is in sight of the process? Do they tell you? Is it clear when it's going to finish? Does it happen suddenly?
So in our case, and for reasons which are sort of almost too complex to try and unpick on this call, but are detailed in the book. There was an emergency meeting that we were kind of called to. Things very nearly all came to a point where the entire process fell apart. It kind of went right to the very brink.
Mm.
And the next day, I received an email from the Bethlehem secretary saying that the process had concluded, and giving a date for the mikveh and the phone number of the man with the scalpel, who in fact phoned me up before I'd even finished reading the email, and suddenly I was on a call, and suddenly we'd gone from months and years of not knowing what was happening, and if anything was happening, to suddenly planning, a date with the Moyle at the next available opportunity, which was the next weekend, which I think was about 2 days after the phone call. And suddenly working out if it were possible to sufficiently heal from a Brit to be able to perform an Edinburgh Fringe show 2 weeks later. And
No,
to
this
and
this obviously was probably the biggest thing that you were anxious about and scared of, and yet this is the thing you need to do to finish the process, which
Yes.
I suppose is an anticipation of a sense of relief and completion. So you've got these competing emotions.
Completely. Well, it seems very, very, very surreal to be sort of actively working as hard as you can towards a surgery that you are utterly terrified of having, and in a perfect world would not be having. But again, I mean, yeah, I maybe I realize I didn't lead with that pertinent bit of medical information at the top of all of this. But yes, and apologies to the 61 participants. I realize we've all just met, but no, my freewheeling bohemian parents did not see fit for various reasons, including a curious case of anti-Semitism from a nurse on the day I was born. But I did not receive the Brit Milah, meaning that was just another terrifying negative, really, at the point of trying to work out whether this was possible. It was a huge tick in the no column, obviously, because it was not something that I was keen to have done in my mid-30s, frankly. And during my kind of research, because I was so utterly terrified, that there was a point where I considered going private at the very before writing to the Beth Din, because then you're not a supplicant about that, and then you can go to some sort of fragrant spa and have everything done according to your specifications. But I didn't, A, because I was no less terrified by that. B, because I was well aware of how extraordinarily difficult the conversion process was, and I felt as much as I felt that Eliana and I could live a glorious life together if we got to the end of it, I did not think the odds of that were 100% by any means, because it was so extraordinarily difficult. And you still have to have a Brit at the end of the conversion process, a Hatafat Dam Brit, a ceremonial pinprick drawing of blood. But ultimately their guy is pretty experienced. He's doing this day in, day out. And that would be the full kosher Brit Milah, both the surgical element and the ceremony, the covenant. So yes, once I was able to quasi make peace as best that I could with the procedure itself, which involved spending time on some subreddits that I pray none of you ever have to visit, and assembling some diagrams, because there are, of course, different styles of Brit that an
Oh, really?
adult male.
Can
Yes,
you choose?
indeed you can. You can have the scar line high or low, and the amount of skin removed overall can either be loose or tight. And it is possible to. It's a more, as you'd expect. It's a more nuanced procedure than the one done on an 8-year-old 8-day-old baby. So I shared my requests with the Moyle.
Was this a joint decision? Or was this
Evidently,
entirely up to you?
yeah, what do you think, honey? It's like, it's like when I buy a shirt nowadays,
Yeah,
what do you think? And she'll go, well, hold on a second, think about that. Um, no, in this matter, I was very much actively encouraged to make my own choice, and the one that I felt most able to come to terms with. And in fact, I did. That was oddly or not, it was one of the final elements before I signed on the dotted line, as it were. Before I was able to phone Eliana up or text Eliana and say, listen, okay, let's do it. I'm in if you are. Was sending this absolutely berserk email to the Moyle saying, hello, so sorry to trouble you. I would be hugely grateful if it could look a bit more like this as opposed to like that. And yeah, he phoned up again within seconds, very efficient man, and said, yeah, that's fine. We're used to doing that style. So not to worry. Good luck with it all, and see you in a couple of years, I hope. And eventually, after a winding and circuitous and sort of at times fairly calamitous, journey, we did see each other once again, and he was as good as his word.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Um, you've you've shone a light by writing this book on a world that most people don't see, don't know about. Has there been any feedback or comeback from the Dayanim? Are they aware what you've done? Are they interested? Are they disinterested?
I could never, I could never and would never presume to sort of speak on the behalf of the Dayanim. I'd be fairly surprised if they weren't aware of it. Jewish life being as
Mm,
interconnected as it is. Um, my look, needless to say, the the great fear, I needed to be able to make my peace with publishing
mm,
in the knowledge that the repercussions could, at the very worst, in the nightmare scenario, somehow result in some kind of de-ratification or something. And I had no, I mean, there is no reason for that to happen that I'm aware of. It's not even possible as far as I'm aware of. But I would, it was a terrifying prospect. Um, but thankfully that hasn't happened. And the feedback that I've had from the communities that I'm a part of, the communities that I've been a part of, has thankfully been overwhelmingly positive to my absolute relief and sort of joy.
We have a question from a viewer, Alan Neller. He says, "How long did it take you to write the book? Was it difficult to sell to a publisher, and how long did that take?"
All good questions. Thank you, Alan. It took me, I think it's hard to say because I didn't clear the decks and work on that alone. I was working on sort of multiple things at once, but I feel like it was about a sort of 9 month process, I think. And it's my first book. It's the first thing that I've written, so I have no idea whether it was comparatively difficult or not. I have no other frame of reference. I was astonished and surprised at what felt like a fairly smooth process. I was very lucky to have a wonderful agent, and she went out and she's quite old school and quite fabulous and sort of fab. And so she loves a phone call and like emails when necessary, but normally she'll kind of just sort of phone up. And she mentioned that she was having some lunches, and then phoned up and said, "Yes, I've spoken to Penguin, and they were the ones that I wanted for you. So yeah, shall we?" Which I was over
Yeah.
the moon with. So they were, yeah, they were supportive, curious, very conscientious kind of custodians of the story, great editors, and also it's not something that I hadn't a bit like girlfriends. I hadn't had an opinion one way or another. Um, but think as to whether or not they were Jewish. But the fact that no one involved in the publication of the book was Jewish, I was sort of pleased with in a certain sense. I was really glad that they were taking this story on, and also that they were interested in it. And I was also on a sheer pragmatic level, I found it very positive and useful to have a non-Jewish team because it meant that everything I was writing was being filtered through the framework of people who wouldn't necessarily know what a minyan is or a kiddush is or a chuppah. So no assumed knowledge, meaning that it kind of keeps you honest in terms of trying to tell a story that you could tell across the Friday night dinner table to a Jewish family in about 20 seconds,
Mm.
but to a non-Jewish audience possibly takes 20 odd chapters.
Yeah. Is there a piece of advice you'd give to somebody who finds themselves in a similar situation to you?
I mean, I suppose my main piece of advice is that it is unlikely to go as complexly for that person as it did for me. There are a series of specifics which are unlikely to be replicated. Um, that said, it is an immense challenge. It will be a huge challenge, and it's one that should be taken immensely seriously because take up an enormous part of your life. It will reshape your life in lots and lots of ways, and for an unspecified period of time, it will have this additional layer of uncertainty to it. The meetings that you have are things which will add an immense sense of pressure to the way that you go about your day to day. And there's huge amounts of information to internalize and to learn, and as we all know, the practice of being Jewish is a lifelong pursuit, however you go about it. And particularly in its most orthodox form, there are huge amounts to take on. That said, good luck.
You clearly have a talent for writing. The book is it's entertaining, it's amusing, but it's also ruthlessly honest, and there's sort of peaks and troughs of emotion. Any plans to write something else?
Yes, well, I'm going to convert to Islam next, and
Very good.
no, there's I certainly have plans to write something else. Dot 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 question mark. Needless to say, I didn't have any plans to write a memoir. It just so happened that I ended up in an extraordinary series of events, and that felt like the most kind of cogent way to express myself. I'd love to write another book,
Mm.
and I'm actively waiting for inspiration to strike down. Yeah, I'm trying to work out what will happen next, and in the meantime, I am uh, further uniting the worlds of writing and performance, and I'm turning the story making the cut into a live show, which I'm taking to the Edinburgh Festival this August and to the Soho Theatre this November. So
Oh, well,
please
good.
do
Yeah, good luck with
come
that.
along and say
Yeah.
hello if you happen to be either in Edinburgh in August or in London in November. So that's my first solo endeavor as well. So I'm excited and terrified in equal measure, because I'm used to having Ivan by my side for both the highs and the lows, and
Mm.
whatever happens, I'm going to have to take it on the chin.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be wonderful. Max, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. This
Thank
book
you.
is available from all good bookshops. It's a really good read. I'm recommending it. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you some of my photos, which I hope you'll enjoy looking through. Now, just a few words about our upcoming program before we leave you. Next Monday, we welcome Professor Shaul Harel. He and I will be talking about his remarkable memoir, A Child Without a Shadow, which covers his life from surviving the Holocaust in Belgium to his groundbreaking medical work in Israel. To book for that, please visit milim.org.uk. You can sign up to our newsletter, and that way you'll be sure to be the first to hear about whatever we've got coming up. All these online events are free, but you can, if you wish, make a small donation to help with our costs. There is a link in the chat. This being our 10th anniversary, we're trying to raise a fund to help our future program. It remains for me to thank our guest, Max Olesker. Once again, thank you so much, Max. This has been really, really a real joy to chat with you.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
And looking forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.